You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome back to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. I hope you had a decent Thanksgiving and that you didn't kill your relatives or they you over the gravy and mashed potatoes. Myself, I slept and read and did not see relatives, and that was not a bad thing. Today we have an interesting show for you and a slightly different one. We have an expanded Surrealism Corner, just for the holiday hell of it and the fun of it, and we have a shortened Inside the Headlines section just today, because I figured either like me you're a news junkie, in which case you've been glued to the hearings, or else you're so sick of the news that you're not glued to the hearings and you can't bear to hear another bit. So that's part shortened and surrealism is lengthened. And a guest who is extremely interesting and will teach you more about women and HIV/AIDS than you ever thought you needed to know, but you do. And, of course, fighting words. But before any of that, we've got to go inside the headlines. For today's condensed news section, so as to enlarge the Surrealism Corner this episode, we're going to do a series of one-paragraph quickies. 5 hats off for recent beautiful active citizenry. 1. The group American Oversight, some lawyers and paralegals, ordinary citizens who are not affiliated with parties, but who creatively and brilliantly used the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, to obtain papers denied Congress by the White House, State Department, and Justice Department. Hats off. Also, 4 women witnesses before congressional committees who demonstrated exceptional expertise, authority, a passion for democracy, and a refusal to be trivialized or bullied. Ambassador Maria Yovanovitch, former White House National Security Aide Fiona Hill, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Laura Cooper before the Intelligence Committee, and Stanford Constitutional Law Professor Pamela Karlan before Judiciary. Now, anyone under the illusion that this is still not a profoundly sexist and racist society should dwell on the fact that 24 hours after Mike Bloomberg, white, male, billionaire, announced his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination, he sailed right into 4th place, bumping Senator Kamala Harris to 5th. Now, for want of sufficient funds, she's been forced to drop out of the race, potentially leaving this once historically diverse field of contenders, all white and mostly male. Kamala still has a bright future, but for myself, well, my teeth haven't stopped grinding yet. Ever wonder how wide is the spread of pollution? A new University of California at Santa Cruz study found 3 times as much mercury in mountain lions in the Santa Cruz Mountains as in the same animals inland. The source? Coal-burning plants. The metal lands in the ocean, sinks to the bottom. Bacteria converts it into a fat-soluble form that's picked up by coastal fog and carried into the mountains. The mercury is absorbed by lichen, which are eaten by deer, which are eaten by mountain lions. Circle of life, circle of death. Men report higher levels of psychological distress when they're the sole household earners, but that distress decreases as their wives earn more money. That's good news. But according to a report published in the Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, although the husband's stress hit a low point when their wives earned 40% of the household income, it began to increase again as the wives began to out-earn the men. If women made more money already than men when they got married, the men did not have the same concern. The long-term study looked at thousands of couples in the United States over 14 years. The Smithsonian Magazine recently ran an obituary that made me cry. cry with fury and frustration at all the facts, the lives, and the knowledge that's been denied us. It was about Barbara Hillary, a pioneering African-American adventurer who had died at age 88. But here's the thing. At age 75, Barbara Hillary had become the first black woman to set foot on the North Pole. She traveled from New York to Norway, camped out on a moving ice floe, took a helicopter ride to a remote, frigid landscape, and skied into the North Pole on April 23, 2007, at age 75. Then, wait for it, 5 years later, at 80, my God, at 80, she made another groundbreaking journey to become the first African-American woman to stand on the South Pole. There was a small story on her at the time in the New Yorker and a bit of coverage in the African-American press. As far as I'm concerned, there should have been parades, holidays, and trumpets from rooftops all over the world. And speaking of so-called lost women, check out Instagram for race_women, honoring our earliest black feminist foremothers. Maya Millett, that's Millett, on Instagram, is a source of reclamation assembling this information, deeply buried, tragically buried, inside the headlines. We have to take a short break here, but coming up still is Fighting Words and my special guest today for the conversation, and right around the corner is the Surrealism Corner, special, elongated, grown just for the holiday season. Subscribe to this program on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review. Follow us on Twitter at WMC Live, like our Facebook page at facebook.com/WMC Live, and visit us at WMCLive.com for more information about our show and our guests.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
We could do with some cheer to celebrate the solstice return of the light to our hemisphere. We've earned it. And a perfect place for that is the Surrealism Corner. Today, we'll start with some happy news, and then move through absurdity into hilarity and wind up with sublimity. How's that sound? Rarely do you hear me quote from a story in The Hollywood Reporter, so for God's sake, pay attention. Stacey Abrams is getting into television. The terrific former Georgia legislator and voting rights advocate, who has been a guest on this program to my delight, she's going to executive produce a drama in development at CBS called Never Tell. Never Tell is based on a novel that she wrote under the pen name Selena Montgomery. It's about a famous linguistics professor with a complicated past who joins forces with a dynamic investigative journalist after the discovery of a cryptic message, which is the only clue in a missing persons case. It sets them off on a partnership working cases for the New Orleans Police Department. Stacey has written 8 novels, which she talked about when she was here, under the Selena Montgomery pen name. A savvy, utterly lovable, gutsy politician with a pop literary streak. I just love her. More pleasant news. New Caledonia is an archipelago about 1,000 miles off Australia's coast in the Coral Sea, which is rich in marine species, including manta rays and sea snakes. Among the sea snakes is the almost 5-foot-long greater sea snake, capable of killing a human with a single bite, and some of them are venomous to boot. But Monique Zenier, age 75, isn't fazed at all by this. She's one of a group of 7 women aged 60 to 75 who regularly snorkel in these waters. What started as a regular physical therapy exercise for her turned into a bounty of data for scientists who study the aquatic snakes. Researchers have come now to rely on the women and nicknamed them the fantastic grandmothers, relying on them to catalog and keep track of the hundreds of greater sea snakes that visit the shallow water bays around the archipelago. Since sea snakes have been little studied because they're dangerous to handle, scientists have previously had to rely mostly on those specimens accidentally caught in fishing nets. But now, as researchers say, the grandmothers have made a great contribution to science. Before the grandmothers swam to the rescue, only 45 greater sea snakes had been cataloged, but in 2017 all that changed. The women meet every morning between 8 a.m. and 8:30, wear diving equipment, swim for an hour or two, then, back on the beach, they have tea and enjoy the beauty of the sight. These are their words. Their photographs have demonstrated at least 140 greater sea snakes within a 25-month period, and recently the grandmothers cataloged their 250th greater sea snake, which they named Annie. The grandmothers claimed that they were once afraid of snakes, but no more, and they've become activists in environmental preservation of the species. Dr. Claire Guin, who is a marine biologist at the University of New Caledonia and who heads the team of researchers collaborating with the women, recommends to scientists that if and when they're in need of volunteers to fill knowledge gaps in their research, they should recruit seniors who want to be citizen scientists. Wonderful phrase. She says, if there's one thing I want everyone to learn from this, it's that you should never underestimate grandmothers. Moving right along into absurdity, a new Morning Consult survey has gauged gender association with everyday objects, finding that food, for example, is viewed as gendered, thus creating obstacles for brand marketers. Is wine a feminine drink? Are scooters more masculine or feminine? What about the practice of binging TV shows? In this nationwide survey, conducted among 2,200 U.S. adults, respondents were asked to rate 130 products and activities on a scale of 1, very masculine, to 10, very feminine. Highlights include the following. Power tools and tampons are products most associated with gender. Well, that's no surprise. The latter certainly makes sense, but the former is ridiculous. Have they never heard of Rosie the Riveter? Drinks, like pina coladas and lattes, are considered feminine, while whiskey and beer are seen as more masculine. The so-called feminine foods are cupcakes and yogurt, while meatloaf and steak are considered masculine. Overall, encouragingly though, the public ranked most objects closer to gender neutral, with an average ranking of 5.3. You ready for some hilarity? Okay. Rats are capable of driving tiny cars, researchers have found. It eases the rats' anxiety. Scientists say they have successfully taught rats to drive teeny cars, which has more potential for human research than you and I might think. University of Richmond in Virginia scientists have proven that little rat brains are more capable of performing complicated tasks than previously recognized, and apparently such learning reduces the rat's stress, the result of which could help scientists understand anxiety and depression in human beings. Kelly Lambert, professor of behavioral neuroscience, created small cars made from clear plastic containers with 3 paw-gripping copper bars that act as steering wheels. When the rats grasped the copper bars with their paws, it created an electrical current that powered the car and moved it in different directions depending on which bar the rats touched. Moving the car forward usually led the rats to a treat of Fruit Loops. Scientists learned the rats were less anxious when they got to drive the cars by testing the rodent excrement for stress hormones. The rat poop tests The rat poop tests showed increased DHEA, the hormone that thwarts stress. And the rats that actually drove the car appeared less stressed than rats who were merely passengers in remotely controlled versions. Backstreet driving is very stressful for everybody. The driving rate held an interest for the rats in driving throughout the trial and showed more learning capacity when compared with rats less stimulated. They stayed interested. The results of the study could impact future research on Parkinson's disease and on motor skills and spatial function in humans in general, and could be used also, Lambert said, to study how depression influences motivation. And now for the sublime. Great blue whales. They are the largest animals ever to have lived, and they exist at the limits of biology. A blue whale heart alone is so big that a person could shimmy through its valves. It's so big that it weighs 1,000 pounds, as much as a cow. It's so big that a single heartbeat sends 60 gallons of blood coursing through its veins. Now, for the first time, scientists have fixed a non-invasive heart rate monitor to a wild blue whale, so they could report in a new study, and they were able to trace the heart rate. At rest, the heart beat 15 times a minute, but dropped to 2 heartbeats per minute when diving. And as it surfaced and lunged after food, the rate jumped to around 40 BPM, the fastest a heart of this mass could go. Sublime behemoth, like a gigantic mobile redwood of the sea. Such a creature should fill us with awe at the multitudinous array of life forms on this planet, those we know about and those about which we have much, or everything, to learn. The more I learn, the more I begin to think that such creatures are the reality of this world, and it's Homo sapiens who is surreal. Time for another quick break, but coming right up is a conversation with the author of the most revealing and surprising book about women and HIV/AIDS you will ever encounter. And believe me, you should encounter this book. The Women's Media Center, founded in 2005 by Jane Fonda, Gloria Steinem, and myself, is a progressive, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to make women visible and powerful in media. You can learn more about the WMC at womensmediacenter.com.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
I'm privileged this week to have as my guest for the conversation Dr. Celeste Watkins-Hayes, who is professor of sociology and African American studies at Northwestern University and is an author and educator widely credited for her research on public policies and governmental agencies targeting low-income families, as well as current work on the social and economic consequences of HIV/AIDS for women of diverse racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. She's also a faculty fellow. She's a girl, though, but she's a fellow at Northwestern's Institute for Policy Research and Cells to Society, C2S, the Center on Social Disparities in Health. She's former chair of the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern, one of the top Black Studies departments in the country and home to one of the few PhD programs in African American Studies offered in the United States. Her first book, The New Welfare Bureaucrats, Entanglements of Race, Class, and Policy Reform, won prizes. She herself has won awards and medals and has been widely quoted in the popular press as a national expert on social inequality. She served on the board of trustees of Spelman College for 13 years and serves on the advisory board of the Spelman College Women's Research and Resource Center, and she proudly focuses her scholarship, speaking directly to current policy debates. And does her new book ever do that? Here is Dr. Celeste Watkins-Hayes. Dr. Watkins-Hayes, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you.
You have written, I think, what will be a historically important book, and a very surprising one. The title, it's a scholarly book, but it's a book about real people. So not to be scared off by the word scholarly, although you have the most distinguished credentials for an academic that I've seen in a long time. The book is called Remaking a Life: How Women Living with HIV/AIDS Confront Inequality. The stories stay with you. They are amazing stories because, oddly enough, and this is where the surprise comes in, it would sound like that's a terribly saddening, heartbreaking book. It's not. It's a story of self-insistent resurrection. There's this sentence that I'd love you to start off with, if you don't mind. Injuries of inequality produce and are produced by a compromised ability to protect oneself from harm, which, when one dwells on it, is a profound sentence. Talk about that for a minute, Celeste.
Absolutely. Well, in the course of doing this research, I thought it was really critical that we understand what I call injuries of inequality. And these are the things that, whether it is a result of racial or economic or gender discrimination, make it so that we have fewer resources and protections, if you will, to protect ourselves from harm, whether it's a particular health diagnosis, whether it is a negative life situation. And really what I wanted to talk about in this book are some of the invisible buffers that people have or don't have that may make it more likely that they will experience what we commonly think of as social disparities of health. So the problem with that term, social disparities of health, is that it suggests that it's a very kind of passive voice term. It suggests that things just happen to us.
Yeah.
But injuries of inequality reminds us that inequity is at the center of many of our experiences.
Right.
So whether it's our health outcomes, whether it's where we end up living, where we end up working, what kind of safety net we have available to us when things go wrong. We have vulnerabilities or buffers by virtue of our social position. So I really wanted to show what results from that kind of system, what results that's injurious to our health and well-being. So the term injuries of inequality seemed like a perfect way to understand an HIV diagnosis.
Absolutely.
It's a medical condition, but it's also the result of systematic inequity.
Yes, and you show that throughout the book. It's a writer to writer. It's an excellent phrase, which I will borrow in future and credit you with. Injuries of inequality. It's superb because it as you show, those injuries evidence themselves through many processes, through mass incarceration, through residential segregation, through chronic unemployment, and through health and housing and education and in non-economic well-being and identity formation. So if there are, never mind struggles for mobility, it's just everyday survival. And even political resistance becomes constrained. And then if you're hit with some major catastrophe, which is either HIV/AIDS or we've seen it in the recent hurricanes, and you are already at a disadvantage, and the disadvantage is not coincidental, as you say, it didn't just happen. It is deeply involved with racism, with sexism, I think sometimes with ageism, but with all of those embedded inequalities in a pale male patriarchal structure that make it worse. And yet, in this book, which is, after all, about remaking lives, the women who have somehow come back from this is the story of this book. It's an alternate support system because there isn't a real one in the culture, in the society. Share, if you don't mind, Dawn's story, the woman who said, if it weren't for HIV, I would probably be dead, which is an amazing phrase.
Absolutely. And you can imagine that is quite a jarring comment for someone to make. And the book really looks at, it begins with that quote as a starting point.
Right.
To really understand that puzzle. Why would someone say something like that? And how is it possible that an illness, an epidemic that's responsible for the deaths of millions around the world helped to save a life? But what Dawn is talking about is, first of all, she's describing, and she goes on to talk about the injuries of inequality that she has suffered.
That's right.
The experiences of childhood sexual trauma, the experiences of living in an economically and racially segregated context where opportunities were few, and the educational system had largely failed her. In a context in which mass incarceration was creating a dynamic where friends and family members were being warehoused by the criminal justice system. So Dawn found herself in a state of drug addiction, dealing with the trauma of sexual violence, homeless, and without a lot of economic or social resources to survive.
So
and we trace her story of living on the streets through that set of experiences.
So even having the diagnosis and then being in enforced incarceration, in rehab, in even that was better than what her norm, in quotes, had been before. Because the former was so riddled with inequality. I mean, you also have this wonderful phrase, sexualized drug economy. That there's so much of this, the sexualized violence, the sexualized drug economy for these women from the time they were little girls, has been so endemic and epidemic that for her to have the courage and the intellectual ferocity to make a difference, no matter what, is an incredible story.
Absolutely. So what happens to Dawn is, after years of living in a state that I call dying from a whole host of injuries of inequality and social challenges,
right.
She is diagnosed with HIV, and it takes her years to come to grips with the diagnosis. It was not an overnight dynamic, but she eventually finds a place where she realizes that in order to live, in order to go from dying from to living with HIV, she's going to have to deal with the trauma that she has faced all of her life, and she's going to have to come up with a different set of coping and surviving strategies that her drug addiction had afforded her. So she finds a community within the HIV safety net. And this goes back to this complicated idea that she puts forth where she says, if it weren't for HIV, I'd probably be dead. Because what Dawn is really saying is, if it weren't for the HIV community, I'd probably be dead. Yes. So then in the book, I look at how she enters into this community, how she finds essentially four things. First of all, access to health care, which becomes critically important to manage her HIV diagnosis, address her addiction, but also get access to both services for her physical health, but also services for her mental health that will help her survive into the future. The second thing that she gets access to is a very robust system of social support. So through HIV support group meetings where women are coming together and having conversations about their lives and supporting each other, whether it's through the case management system that is offered through our Ryan White Care program, which offers assistance to people living with HIV. She's got people in her life who are acting as brokers and connecting her to resources and services and people that are going to be very, very helpful to her in her movement from what I call dying from to living with HIV and her other injuries of inequality.
I just want to put a little parenthesis in there saying that safety net, which so often is non-governmental. I remember when Dazan Diallo founded Sister Love in Atlanta, and so many. Yes, I knew her. And
I interview her in the book.
Yes, you do. And so many of these support groups, which were which were founded on a hope and a prayer, and with very little assistance. And I mean, they were performing the services to the community that a government really should have been doing, but they were going to do it anyway because it wasn't there. Is a whole other story in this book that just brightens the heart. Please go on.
Yes, the creation of the safety net. So the third thing that Dawn gets access to is some modest economic assistance that provides her housing and escape from homelessness and provides her with the daily sustenance that she's going to need to live. And she gets access to that through connecting to the HIV community. And then the final thing that's offered to her is an on-ramp to political and civic engagement.
Right.
So it's not just about becoming a recipient of services. It's about using one's voice and learning how to speak truth to power, to become an advocate in one's community, to become an HIV activist, or to be a person who's doing speaking engagements or mentoring other women who are living with HIV. So it was through those four things, the healthcare access, the social support, the economic assistance, and the on-ramp to civic and political engagement, that we see Dawn and others like her move from what I call dying from to living with to thriving despite HIV and other injuries of inequality. And as you mentioned in the book, I had to ask the question, where did this support community come from? What's the history of it? So I tell a history of HIV/AIDS activism that centers women, that centers people of color, that really highlights the ways in which the HIV coalition has actually been quite diverse in terms of how people from various backgrounds have come together to put together a social support safety net and a medical safety net for people living with HIV. And I argue that the HIV community really deserves a lot of credit for the safety net that they've built and the model that they've created for how you assist marginalized populations and how you do it while also training people on how to be activists so that they can change some of the structural dynamics and confront some of the structural dynamics that hobbled them in the first place.
What is so wonderful to read is I don't know what to call it. I want to say transformative energy that begins to flicker through them and then gleam as they move from passive to active on their own lives and then in society. It's this process. Having some support made me angry all over again in retrospect, given what they had been through, and the two things that emerge as such catalysts and with such centrality to HIV/AIDS. Are gender and sexism and racism. I mean, it is just mind blowing. I mean, it isn't in one respect, but the early diagnosis, as you point out, linked to medical care reduces the number of new infections. Okay, but among racial groups, Black Americans are the least likely to receive medical treatment after diagnosis, and that in turn results in greater risk of transmission within the population, which, as you and I know, that the population gets blamed for being sloppy or not caring, when in fact the majority of people don't know that they're transmitting. I mean, and then what are they met with? Demands for abstinence only. I mean, there are higher rates of STDs in Black and brown communities for a reason, because there's a dearth of testing and of treatment opportunities. So all of these things come back down to the root of what you call
injuries of inequality. Yes. And I point to the unfortunate irony in my book. The fact that it took an HIV diagnosis for women to get access to the services that they had long needed. Because Dawn, the person who is centered in the introduction of the book, needed services for quite some time. before she was able to get access to them. And she got access to them through the HIV community. So I asked this question: why does it take a raging fire to be blazing before we install the fire extinguisher?
Exactly.
How can we think about, yes, how can we think about the ways in which race and class and gender fuel epidemics? Because we know the science of HIV. We know how to prevent it. We now have the biomedical tools available in terms of medications and in terms of being able to not just prevent the disease, but also treat the disease. So the question becomes, why are people of color disproportionately impacted? And you're exactly right. This is about access to information, access to resources, access to care, such that when communities and networks are segregated, when they don't have access to resources, illnesses and other injuries of inequality can proliferate. And we need to confront that, and we need to tell the truth about that, because you're right, too often it becomes a blaming the victim kind of experience. It's about Dawn's promiscuity. It's about Dawn's drug use. It's about all of the other women that I capture and what they are doing as individuals. But what I really try to highlight in the book are how individual behaviors are taking place within a network, and they're taking place within a structural context that makes it so that those who are in vulnerable networks are more likely to find themselves with an HIV diagnosis.
Absolutely.
More so than those who may be engaging in the exact same behavior but are not embedded in a vulnerable network, in a vulnerable structure, because they've got the protections around them to prevent injuries of inequality from happening. They get access to services. They get access to information. They get access to care quite readily. They're not seen as expendable, quite frankly, so that they're protected in particular kinds of ways. So what we find with women, what we find with people of color, are the ways in which their life experiences create the context for future vulnerability, because unfortunately we do not prioritize their lives in the way that we should.
Well, I think we not only do not prioritize those lives, but I have to say I think that there is a profound ignorance, and I even have to say I think in many cases a willful ignorance, which, although shocking and enraging, is true on the part of officials, policymakers, the medical establishment in some cases. I remember a long conversation I had with a woman in Kenya some years ago when AIDS was still a death sentence. It was, there was still no way of, and it was the leading cause of death of women, I think, between 19 and 30 in the States, or something close to that. And it was even higher in some African countries. And she was an activist, and she said to me, laughing in despair, she said, you know what they tell us? They tell us, well, just make men wear condoms. They do not understand the position of women. They do not understand the powerlessness of women. They do not understand that in many communities, any woman saying that gets herself beaten to a pulp. I then heard the same thing about a year later from a white woman in Minnesota. Of a supposed middle-class family. But in other words, the nuances, or not so nuances, of sexism and racism seem brushed aside in considerations of solutions. And what this book points out is that when you do that long enough, you compound the problem, and people will take the matter into their own hands, and mostly women, it seems to me, have done these support networks, and they have done so creatively and staunchly and brilliantly.
Absolutely. And what we have to remember is that our prevention tools, like condoms, like PrEP, for example, which pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is a pill that you can take to prevent infection. We have to remember that those are health tools with social significance.
Exactly.
And what that means is for women to adopt those tools, whether it's condoms or PrEP, they've got to grapple with this question of, what does this say about them, right? Yeah. Is this about, I am taking charge of my sexual health? Mm-hmm. It could be that. but it is also for some women about, what does this say about my cleanliness? What does this say about
Sure.
whether I'm promiscuous or not?
Sure.
What does this say about whether I'm faithful to my partner? And if any of those things get called into question, women are less likely to adopt those tools. So I found in the book women talking about, I was aware of condoms, but I thought that this was a demonstration of my love to not ask him to put one on. I didn't want him to think that I was unclean. I didn't want him to think that I was unfaithful.
Of course.
And I really wanted to demonstrate my commitment. Mm-hmm. And then we have some women who are in even more vulnerable circumstances that talked about there could be violence if I suggested that that the person that I'm with put on condoms, because it's a question of, well, what do you have and what have you been doing?
Right.
That makes you say that, and it creates a really problematic dynamic for women. So what we're seeing now in the conversation is, how can we think about tools that give women the agency and the power to be able to protect their own health without having to have this social negotiation and without necessarily having to take on this barrier or this burden of, what does this say about who I am as a woman if I'm going to adopt this tool?
Right.
So there's some optimism around PrEP, for instance, because women can just take that alone by themselves once a day. Mm-hmm. But of course, we know the question of access is a really, really big factor there.
I was just going to raise that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
The nuances and detail and complexities that you cover and make accessible for the average reader in this book are really remarkable, Celeste. It is called Remaking a Life: How Women Living with HIV/AIDS Confront Inequality. And we've been speaking with Dr. Celeste Watkins-Hayes, and I thank you for this book and for being with us, and wish you all possible good luck with a very wide reading audience, because this is revelatory of women, of people of color, of inequality, of the way this society treats illness, of so many things that are knitted into the subject and are even larger than it. So thank you again.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And you're welcome, and thank you for having me on the show.
Time for a final break, and then I'll be back with some fighting words.
For the smartest talk about news, politics, sex, books, religion, race, and more, it's Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan. Audacious, witty, provocative, informative, and fun. It's Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan. Talk radio with a brain.
Let's have another go at language. That's an apt subject for fighting words. I'll resist the temptation to rave at length about the way Trump's language tics have seeped into the language of even his antagonists, Democratic senators, serious journalists, legislators, and constitutional lawyers now drop phrases like, "This I can tell you," and far too many gushes of incredibles and biggists and unbelievables for comfort. Everybody has such tics, of course, and people in the public eye get imitated, like Biden's overuse of the phrase, "the fact of the matter is," when he's stalling, when his mind is racing for an answer. But the spread of Trump talk, the hype of an over-caffeinated salesman crossed with the lingo of a mobster, is particularly odious. This adoption of a word or phrase, a sort of zeitgeist speak, seems a rapidly increasing trend, probably influenced by the speed of social media communication and, in the case of wealthy, dominating nations and languages, a consumer mentality that voraciously chews up and spits out new things before you can taste them. For example, doubling down and "let's unpack this," all the rage in the past months are heard more rarely now. Starting brand new sentences with the word so as a continuance of what is not being continued appears to begin to be waning slightly, to my relief. I'm grateful, though, that the F word, feminism, is still trendy, since it took so long getting there and required Hollywood stars to popularize it. The latest hot phrase going around is on the spectrum, as in referring to the spectrum of autism, Asperger's, and related conditions. These conditions, about which we still know relatively little, are serious. At their extreme, they can be tragically debilitating and incapacitating, but can also be fertile territory for insight and intelligence to gleam through the suffering, although that gleam is not necessarily expressed or displayed in a societally traditional manner. I celebrate the surfacing of any so-called taboo subject and breaking the silence that enforces pain. I also loathe anti-science, anti-vaxxer types. The more we discover about all the mysteries of the great brain and nervous system, the better off we'll be as a species. It's splendid that we now understand such conditions exist along a spectrum, like so much else, in this case, a spectrum of neurodiversity. What is culturally bizarre, however, is the manner in which the phrase on the spectrum is being snapped up, sometimes as almost chic, sometimes even being applied to persons not on such a spectrum who, rather, might choose for good or ill reasons to be less emotionally available to others than others might wish. When we treat words as if they had no meaning, words lose meaning. I could, for instance, point out that in a patriarchy most men are socialized to be emotionally unavailable. Does that mean most men are on the spectrum? It made me smile recently to overhear a woman at a neighboring table in a restaurant exclaim, "Oh God, I'd certainly like to be on the spectrum so far as Roger is concerned." But it also made me sad. On the spectrum now is an aspiration, a chic new state of being? We're so surrounded by cheapened language and the abuse and misuse of ratiocinative thought that it's as if our natural resistance, if such a thing only existed, to viral language has been weakened. For myself, when I feel I'm coming down with a cliché or a case of jargon, I quickly megadose on my betters, my elders. 2 women we have lost in the past 2 years. 2 great writers, Ursula K. Le Guin, who died in 2018, and Toni Morrison, who died last August. Both were 88 years old. Here are a few passages of comfort and of warning from Ursula's book, Words Are My Matter, Writings About Life and Books. She writes, "Take the time to learn how to get the words right. It takes a while to learn how to use words. It takes practice. It takes work, years of work. But if that's what you want to do, nothing in the world can give you a sweeter reward than doing it, doing the work itself. Truth-telling is a great thing and a rare one. Enjoy it." And this, hard times are coming, when we will be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now, can see through our fear-stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine real grounds for hope. We'll need writers who can remember freedom, poets, visionaries, realists of a larger reality. And here is the majesty of Morrison from her Nobel Prize in Literature acceptance speech in 1993. The systematic looting of language can be recognized by the tendency of its users to forego its nuanced, complex, midwifery properties, replacing them with menace and subjugation. Oppressive language does more than represent violence. It is violence. Does more than represent the limits of knowledge. It limits knowledge. Whether it is obscuring state language or the faux language of mindless media, whether it's the proud but calcified language of the academy or the commodity-driven language of science, whether it's the malign language of law without ethics, or language designed for the estrangement of minorities, it is the language that drinks blood, laps vulnerabilities, tucks its fascist boots under crinolines of respectability and patriotism, as it moves relentlessly toward the bottom line and the bottomed-out mind. Sexist language, racist language, theistic language, all are typical of the policing language of mastery, and cannot, do not, permit new knowledge or encourage the mutual exchange of ideas. Word work is sublime, because it is generative. It makes meaning that secures our difference, our human difference, the way in which we are like no other life. We die. That may be the meaning of life. But we do language. That may be the measure of our lives. Privileged to have personally known both Le Guin and Morrison, I miss their presence on the planet keenly, but the legacy of their language still sings across the page. Those are my fighting words. Add yours on Twitter, and remember to tag us at WMC Live and use the hashtag #FightingWords. And that's our show for this week. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and now Instagram at @TheRobinMorgan, and you can check out my blog at robinmorgan.net and find my latest book of poems, Dark Matter, and my brand new novel, Parallax, wherever books are sold. Opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily represent the Women's Media Center. Here's the family for Women's Media Center Live. Executive producer as well as founding and sustaining sponsor, Regina K. Scully. WMC president and co-executive producer of this program, Julie Burton. I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. Join us again next time on Women's Media Center Live.